In this video, we're going to update our user repository, our GPA repository, and we're going to add one more method, which is going to use native SQL query. So let's assume we need to add one method which needs to return all users from our database table who have their email address verified or confirmed. Let me add a little code snippet here, and I'll walk you through. Let me import query first. The query annotation needs to come from data GPA repository package. And now I will need to import page. It comes from Spring Framework data domain. And I will import pageable, which comes from Spring Framework data domain as well. Okay, so we now have two new lines of code in our user repository. What do they do? Well, first of all, we've added one more method here. Earlier in our examples, we were using Spring Data GPA query methods, for example, to fetch a user details from a database by their email address. We would write a query method that reads find by email. This time, we are not going to follow the pattern of query methods, although we could, but we can skip that and we can name our methods whatever we want. So I'm adding a new method that will return all users from our database that have email address verified. But the list of users from a database will be returned by an SQL query that I'm providing inside of the query annotation. And because there can be thousands of users in my database table, I'm using paging and sorting repository together with page and pageable. So for this method, find all users with confirmed email address to be able to return list of users that was read from a database, I'll need to perform native SQL query. And the native SQL queries are specified inside of the add query annotation. Add query annotation takes value and it takes native query equals true. These two are very important. If we do not provide native query equals to true, and if we do not provide value, but simply use add query, and inside of add query we provide the SQL query, then that's going to be treated as Java persistence query language rather than native SQL query. Another very important moment is that this SQL query has to be native and real. In other words, I can take this SQL query and then I can run it from a command line when I log in into my database. And in this SQL query, I need to use the details of my database table. For example, when I say select all from and then the name of the database table. In my case, the name of my database table is users. This is why I'm using here users. And this is very different when we use not native query, but Java persistence query language, where we don't provide the database table name, but rather the entity name. Okay, so in native queries, when you write SQL query, you use the details of the real database table. So I'm selecting from table users, where email verification status is equal to true, and email verification status is the name of a database table column. If I make a typo here, then my SQL query will not work. Now, because we are using pageable request together with add query annotation, we might want to specify the count query. Let me put it here, count query equals, and I'll put the native query on the new line. So the count query looks exactly the same way as the query inside of the value. Let me paste it here, except it needs to have this count all records. The count query is being used by Spring Data GPA to figure the total amount of records that it needs to split into different pages. We would not use count query if this was not pageable request, if we did not need to use pagination. If we do not provide count query, then Spring Data GPA will try to figure out the count of records by itself. But if we want to make sure that it really works the way we want it to work, it's better to provide both value and then the count query. Okay, so I think this is it. Let's try testing this code and see if it really works.